Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today is another episode in our accelerated series, 11 Critical Battles. And for the first time in this series, we're going to move out of the ancient Near East and into Europe to talk about the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. So what's so special about Marathon that it gets a place on this list? Well, a couple of things. First, it's a famous battle that illustrates a few of our principles beautifully. Second, this battle represents the first time the Greeks stopped the Persian Empire from pushing into Europe. So it was probably pretty critical to the way our Western culture eventually developed. And of course, this is my list, so I get to include the battles I want to talk about. And this one is pretty cool. So first things first, let's do some background. You probably remember the Assyrian Empire from the episode on King Tiglath-Pileser III and his siege of the city of Arpad in 743 BCE. Well, the Assyrian Empire reached its greatest extent under Ashurbanipal in about 671 BCE, encompassing all of the Fertile Crescent from Mesopotamia down the Levant and up the Nile to the First Cataract. But the empire declined after Ashurbanipal until its capital, Nineveh, was sacked in 612 BCE. And in the 550s BCE, the Persians stepped into the gap. You'll often hear the Persian Empire referred to as the Achaemenid Empire, or the Achaemenid Persians. That's because the guy who started the ball rolling was Cyrus the Great of the Achaemenid dynasty. So when I mention the Persians and the Achaemenids, I'm talking about the same guys. So the Achaemenids started off as Elamites, ruling the city of Anshan in the portion of modern-day Iran that used to be called Persis. And from there, they set about tearing hell out of any poor bastards unlucky enough to be close to them. Cyrus the Great really kicked things off when he took power in 550 BCE, conquering the Medes and pushing out from there. By the time Cyrus died in about 530 BCE, he had conquered pretty much everything the Assyrians had held, plus Anatolia, Central Asia up to the Aral Sea, and east to the modern Pakistani border. In 20 years, he had conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen. Not a bad effort. His son Cambyses II added Egypt to the empire, and Cambyses' son Darius I pushed the empire to its greatest extent, driving across the Bosporus into the Balkans, west into Libya on the North African coast, and east all the way to the Indus River. Darius is the Achaemenid king the Athenians will be dealing with today. So what made the Persians such badasses? It's not clear what kind of military innovations Cyrus came up with, but it looks like he was just a military genius. Not only that, his rule seems to have been pretty light. He left local rulers in place unless they tried to rebel, adding a few laws and collecting tribute from the lands he conquered. And as long as the conquered territories were willing to acknowledge him as king and pay him tribute and probably send him soldiers, he left them more or less alone. He raised and equipped a professional army with soldiers from all over the empire. So as the empire grew, the size of the armies he could put into the field grew with it. Kind of a virtuous circle, if you will. And people seem to have wanted to follow him. I mean, who doesn't want to follow a winner who keeps winning? I don't know much about Cambyses, except that he ruled from about 530 to about 522 BCE. Then Darius I took over, continuing his grandfather's policy of conquest. So that brings us up to speed on the Persians. What about the Athenians? Well, Athens was one of the major city-states of the region we call Greece today. The city sits on a hill near the east coast of Greece, pretty much directly across the Aegean Sea from Anatolia. It dominated a triangular peninsula called Attica, which is where the Persians are going to land their ships when it comes time to throw down here in a little bit. And Athens, as of about 510 BCE, was a democracy. Now, when I say democracy here, you probably shouldn't be thinking about anything much like we've got today. It was a democracy in the sense that citizens could get together and vote on important questions, like who was going to be in charge how they were going to take care of funding and planning for major building projects, and whether or not they would go to war. But the citizens who got to vote on those questions were free adult males, not slaves, not women, not children. So about 30% of the population was making decisions on behalf of the other 70%. Still, it's the first government of its type that I know of, and it seems like it's worth mentioning since both the Roman Republic and the U.S. modeled our governments, at least in part, on the Athenian ideal of democracy. And it's also important in thinking about the Athenian mindset here. They'd only earned the right to govern themselves about 20 years before Marathon, and they'd had to kick out their last tyrant to get there. Yes, tyrant was a real title for a Greek leader. That's where we get the word from. But the Athenians, having kicked out one tyrant 2 decades earlier, weren't about to bend over for another one without a fight. So you might have noticed a little detail I went over pretty fast there. Athens was a city-state. It controlled a tiny little speck of the land area of present-day Greece. Meanwhile, the Achaemenids controlled a land area a little more than half the size of modern Europe. How the hell does this fight even make it into the history books? Well, let's get into that. So the Persians at this time fielded the biggest army in the world. Darius I had access to somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 fighting men. Maybe more if he demanded all his client kingdoms or satrapies send their levies. They would have been armed pretty much like the Assyrians, with iron-tipped spears and composite bows as their primary infantry weapons. The infantry would have carried wicker shields and probably axes or short swords as secondary weapons. If they wore armor, it was light, probably leather helmets and maybe leather jerkins. It doesn't look like they had the kind of iron-scaled tunics that the Assyrians wore. I saw that double take you did there. Wicker shields? What the hell good is something like that going to do? Well, there's a couple of points here. First, wicker's light and easy to carry, and if it's woven tightly enough, it can provide pretty good protection. And second, this is an example of the kind of brutal calculation a general might have to do. Because a wicker shield will probably stop an arrow or an axe, but it might not stop a heavy spear. But even if it doesn't stop the spear, that spear is now stuck in that shield. It's going to be a pain in the ass to remove it, and that's not something the guy on the front line is going to want to take time to do. So he's either going to try to fight with the shield on his spear, which is going to make him less effective, or he's going to drop his spear and draw his sword, which will make him more vulnerable to attack by your guys with their spears. Small comfort to the poor bastard who got a spear in the neck because his shield didn't stop it, but there you go. The Persians also had an elite infantry unit they called the Immortals. This was a unit of 10,000 soldiers who would be committed wherever necessary to exploit an enemy weakness or plug a hole in friendly lines. They weren't equipped all that much differently from the regular infantry, but they would have been veterans, not green recruits, and their reputation as a unit helped make them especially formidable. The legend is that they were called the Immortals because the unit was always at full strength. Anytime they took losses, new troops would be added just as quickly as possible to bring their numbers back up. So somebody in the Persian army understood the value of morale both to his own side and to the enemy. And the Achaemenid army had a lot of archers and probably slingers as well. One of their favorite tactics was to send massive volleys of arrows at the enemy before the infantry lines made contact. The arrows caused casualties and forced the enemy to raise their shields, which would have made it easier for the Persian infantry to attack with their spears under the raised shields. Of course, it wasn't just infantry. The Persians were still using chariots in 490 BCE, and they had horse cavalry as well. It looks like they had archers on both platforms, and unlike the Assyrians, their horse archers knew how to direct their horses and shoot their bows at the same time. They also had cavalry with spears, but they still wouldn't have been proper heavy cavalry. Every image I've seen has them attacking unarmored or fleeing infantry. The kind of cavalry that could charge a disciplined infantry line was still a long way off. They also had elephants, but I'm going to bet those were mostly used in the eastern part of the empire. At any rate, I don't know of any elephants at Marathon. And Darius had added an arrow to his quiver that Cyrus had never managed. He built a navy that the Achaemenids could use to expand their empire around the Mediterranean. That's going to be important here in a little bit. So what about the Athenians? The Athenian army, and most of the Greek armies in general, were based on infantry. Horses don't seem to have been particularly popular among the Greek city-states, probably because the mountainous terrain would have made them less useful than donkeys or mules. So no Greek city-state that I know of really built much of a cavalry force. Not until Alexander, anyway. No, what the Greeks had was infantry. Heavy infantry, most notably. The backbone of their armies was the hoplite, a dude armed with an 8-foot spear and a large round shield. He wore bronze armor, a heavy cuirass that covered his chest and his back, a helmet that protected his entire head, and greaves to protect his lower legs where they weren't covered by his shield. And they fought in a formation called a phalanx. This was a close order formation that maximized the strengths of fighting with spear and shield and minimized the individual hoplite's ability to make decisions on his own. Because spears are most effective when you can point a lot of them at your enemy, and shields work best when you can overlap them to form a wall. So the phalanx was a moving wall of shields, with each man's shield covering him and the guy on his left. And above the shields was a hedge of spears. John Keegan, one of my favorite military history writers, described the phalanx as something like a plow of flesh, because it was designed to move in only one direction, forward, into the enemy. In the broken, hilly terrain of Greece, the phalanx was a great formation, because it was hard to maneuver around it to take it in the flank, which was a good thing because its flanks were vulnerable. It couldn't turn in a hurry to protect itself. If you could envelop a phalanx, it would fall apart quick. And it makes sense if you think about it. If you're here with your shield and you've got your spear up here over your shoulder and you're locked in with the guys to your left and right, it's going to be difficult to turn either direction to face an enemy that's over there or over there. So the Athenians were able to put 9,000 or 10,000 guys in the field for Marathon, which wouldn't have done much good against a Persian army of 100,000. But it turns out it was just fine for what Darius sent. Because when we're talking about a single battle, it doesn't matter how many guys each side can send to the field. It only matters how many actually get there. So that's a little bit about the forces involved and how they wanted to fight. But why were they there? Now, the Greek city-states were scrappers. The only thing they liked better than fighting each other was fighting some dickheads from outside. So when they heard the world's biggest empire was coming, it didn't sound so much like bad news to them. At worst, they could take the field and die gloriously. At best, they would get to fight a war that people would remember forever. Yeah. And if things ended up somewhere in the middle, well, they could just join up with the Persian army, travel to exotic lands, meet interesting people, and kill them. But remember how they liked fighting each other too? Yeah. Defending each other wasn't high on their to-do list. After all, what if the Persians sent another army at their city while their troops were away protecting Athens or Thebes or wherever? No thank you. So it was kind of unusual when Athens and another city called Eretria both sent forces across the Aegean Sea to Asia Minor to support a Greek city called Ionia in its revolt against the Achaemenids in 498 BCE. That revolt went about as well as you'd expect. And even though the Greeks gave as good as they got for a while, the Persians crushed it and reasserted control over Asia Minor by 493. But it put Athens and Eretria on Darius' world map, and he decided he needed to go get his fly swatter and go smack down some Greeks. Easier said than done, because in order to get to Athens, you either have to march across the Dardanelles and then all the way around the Aegean Sea through a bunch of other states, not to mention mountains, or you have to sail across the Aegean and try your luck with an amphibious landing. Well, Darius tried the overland route in 492 BCE when he sent a general named Mardonius to deal with the situation. Mardonius had pretty good success for a while, subduing Thrace and Macedon and making them into client kingdoms of the Achaemenids. So far, so good. But when he tried to march into Greece proper, a storm wrecked his supply fleet, and he ended up having to turn back. But no storm was going to stop Darius from getting what he wanted, which was the submission of the rest of the Greek city-states. He sent messengers to all the major Greek states in 491 BCE, demanding they submit to his rule. Most of them agreed, except for Athens and Sparta, another major city and maybe the most powerful military state in Greece. And those two couldn't just satisfy themselves with a simple no. Athens and Sparta both decided the best message was not no, but hell no, and fuck you and your family. Both cities killed the messengers Darius had sent to them. So, yeah, that happened. I mean, if you're going to kick a dragon in the nuts, no point half-assing it, is there? So Darius is pissed now. Or, even more pissed. And Athens and Sparta are committed. In pretty much the same way the pig is committed to your breakfast. Good news is, it takes time to prepare an amphibious invasion. The bad news is, Darius already had the ships he needed. So in 490 BC, he loaded up 600 ships, named his generals Datis and Ataphernes to the commanders of the invasion, and sent them on their way. They started off with a little bit of island hopping in the Aegean, attacking and subduing several island states on their way to Eretria. Now, as far as I know, Eretria had already agreed to submit when Darius sent his messenger in 491. But I guess they were still on the naughty list, and Ataphernes decided submission wasn't good enough. He besieged the city, sacked, and burned it. And that would be why you've never heard of Eretria. After that, everybody could tell where the Persians were going to go next, because Attica was just down the coast from Eretria. Now, boats are a great way to move around a region as rugged as Greece. You get to avoid a lot of mountains if you go by water, and you can take a much more direct route in a lot of places, cutting straight across the water instead of winding through the mountains and across narrow spits of land between cities. But there's a downside, because when you travel by water in a place as rugged as Greece, there aren't that many places where you can land your boats. And the people who live there know where those places are. And your troops aren't worth the fuck until their boots are on the ground. If your enemy can get into a position to contest your landing, your job just got a lot harder. To put it another way, the Athenians knew damn well the Persians were going to land at Marathon. And if they could get there first, or at least attack the Persians as they were getting off their ships before they could get fully organized, well, the numbers wouldn't matter nearly as much. So the Athenians started trying to figure out how to stop the Persians from landing. No shit, there they were. The Athenians knew they were in for a hard fight. Obviously, nobody had managed to stand against the Achaemenids in 60 years. And the Persians had kicked the shit out of pretty much every Greek army they had faced in the last 10 years. They had just sacked and burned Eretria, the only ally that had actually fought with Athens against the Persians. And if they could land their ships, the Athenians were sure to be outnumbered. So the Athenians needed to move fast, and they needed their remaining allies to step up. So as their hoplites started marching toward the Bay of Marathon, they sent a runner named Phidippides to Sparta to ask for their help. Remember that name, Phidippides, because we're going to see this poor bastard again. For now, he's running 150 miles from Athens to Sparta. And according to the ancient Greek writers who tell us about the battle, he did it in 2 days. Meanwhile, the Athenians, under the command of a general named Miltiades, marched the 25 miles to Marathon. They got there to discover they were already too late. The Persians were off their ships or maybe in the process of disembarking, so they wouldn't be able to stop them from landing. Estimates as to the size of the Persian army are all over the map. The biggest is something like 600,000, a number we can shit can right away is just absurd since it would require each of the 600 Persian triremes to be carrying 1,000 dudes. Way beyond the capacity of a trireme, even if you used all the rowers as infantry. modern estimates range between 20,000 and 100,000. The real number was probably somewhere around 25,000 infantry with another 1,000 or 2,000 cavalry. It doesn't look like any contemporary sources said anything about the immortals being there, so it was probably just standard infantry. And the way the Persians liked to fight, most of them would have been archers. So the Athenians did the next best thing to blocking the Persians from landing. They set up camp blocking the road from Marathon to Athens and settled in to wait for their reinforcements. They got one piece of good news right away. 1,000 hoplites from the nearby city of Plataea joined them for the fight. That brought their numbers up to 10 or 11,000. But it turned out Sparta was going to be a little longer, because when Phidippides got there, he found the Spartans in the middle of a religious celebration. They would march, they told him, but not till the moon was full. The Athenians would just have to hold out on their own for another 10 days. So Phidippides ran back to Athens with the news and then on to Marathon to tell Miltiades. Well, shit. That one was painful because in addition to being the closest major Greek city-state and the only other major state that had refused to submit to Darius, Sparta, as you probably know, was a military state. Their warrior culture made their army one of the most formidable forces in ancient Greece. So them not coming for 10 days was a pretty big deal. And Athens probably didn't have 10 days to wait. Eventually, Artaphernes was going to decide he had waited long enough, or his scouts were going to find a way to get around the army and head to Athens, or he was going to get back on his ships and sail around Attica to hit Athens itself while its army was waiting in the field. Whatever Miltiades was going to do, he probably was going to have to do it before Sparta could get there. But for now, he settled in to wait. Maybe the Persians would be more patient than he thought. No such luck. On the 5th day, probably the 12th of September, the Athenians attacked. It's not clear why Miltiades decided to attack when he did. There are a few theories, though. Maybe the Persian cavalry left and Miltiades decided to take advantage of the chance to attack without the threat to his flanks and rear. Or maybe Artaphernes, looking to pick a fight, formed up and offered battle. Or maybe the Persians started getting back on their ships and Miltiades was afraid they were going to sail around to Athens while the army sat there. I've also heard the Athenians were rotating command among 10 different generals, and Miltiades was the only one willing to throw down against such a big Persian army. So he waited for his day and ordered the attack. Hell, maybe the Persians moved to attack the town of Marathon and the Athenians decided they had to protect it. Or maybe Artaphernes had his men drop trow or raise their kilts or robes or whatever and moon the Athenians. Bottom line is, we don't know why the Athenians attacked, but they did. They marched down into the plain above the beach and formed up for battle. And the Persians, if they weren't already formed up, got that way in a hurry. So we got 10,000 infantry attacking 25,000 infantry. What the hell were they thinking? And how's this going to go? Be patient. We're going to get there. So first of all, the Persian cavalry wasn't there, and I don't know why. Maybe they'd already gotten on their ships in preparation to embark the rest of the army. Or maybe they were off foraging for food. Or maybe Datis, the cavalry commander, had learned of another Greek force moving to join the Athenians and took his cavalry to see if he could drive it off. Or maybe they were doing what's called a reconnaissance in force, where an entire unit will go off to check something out, not necessarily expecting to fight, but ready for it if it comes. But the cavalry wasn't on the field, which was good news for Miltiades. Remember how we said the flanks of the phalanx were vulnerable? Cavalry is just the kind of unit that can exploit that kind of thing. With Datis off the field, all Miltiades had to worry about was the infantry in front of him. So he's got his guys in the field and he has some friendly terrain to protect his flanks. A hill on his left and a wetland on his right. That's going to make it hard for the Persians to get around his flanks even if the cavalry comes back. But he has another problem, because Artaphernes' line is almost a mile long, and Miltiades is a lot shorter. If he attacks the way he is, he's going to clear his cover before he gets to the Persians, and Artaphernes will be able to envelop his line. Not a good solution. So he thins out his center, reducing the depth of his phalanx there from the usual 8 ranks to 4, so he can make his line as long as the Persians. This is what we call a calculated risk. The phalanx is an extremely strong formation to the front and weak on the flanks, and not very flexible in terms of which direction it's facing. So he wants to keep the Persian infantry from being able to wrap around him. But by thinning his phalanx, he's making it more likely that the Persian infantry will be able to break through his center, splitting his army in 2. That is almost always a disaster. So Miltiades is gambling that his center is going to be able to hold long enough to force the Persians off the field. He left his flanks at full strength, keeping them at their proper depth. Some historians think the battle went down just the way he meant for it to, and weakening his center was part of his plan. But it seems to me he was just trying to make sure his phalanx was long enough to keep the Persians from wrapping him up. Now the Greeks originally formed up their lines a little less than a mile from the Persians, and started forward once Miltiades had his line the way he wanted it. Then, when they got within range of the Persian archers, they charged. The hoplites ran the last 200 meters or so to limit their exposure to the Persian archers. Now remember, these dudes were wearing 40 pounds or so of bronze armor and weapons. This run was no joke, but it beat the hell out of being cut to pieces by Persian arrows, so there's that. And running into the fight did a couple other things as well. It gave the hoplites some momentum when they crashed into the Persian ranks, which would have helped throw the front ranks of the Persian spearmen off balance. And it would have looked scary as hell to the Persian infantry, who had pretty much no option but to stand there wondering who the hell are these crazy motherfuckers running at them. Not great for morale when you think you've already won and your enemy acts like you're just in his way. But the Persians were pros, and they recovered quickly, and their sheer numbers started pulling the weakened Athenian center back. Or it's also possible that the Greek left and right with their deeper formations pushed the Persian wings back away from the center. Because if you haven't figured it out yet, even with a well-recorded fight like this one, a lot of details have been lost in 2,500 years. Personally, I'm inclined to believe that the Greek flanks managed to push the Persian flanks back, because the phalanx was designed to maximize the strength of the spear and shield, and the Greeks were more heavily armored than the Persians, and behind a fairly thin line of Persian heavy infantry with spears and shields, the Persian ranks would have been made up of archers, who by this time would have cased their bows and drawn their swords. And an archer with a sword is at a pretty serious disadvantage against a heavy infantryman with a shield and a spear. Of course, that ignores what would have been a pretty basic feature of phalanx warfare. The front ranks would have sometimes looked a lot like a rugby scrum with weapons. A big part of this kind of fighting would have been just pushing at your enemy until his line broke, or his guys decided, fuck it, I'm out. And there's a lot more weight in 8 ranks than there is in 4, even if some of the 8 ranks are just archers with swords. But however it happened, the thing Miltiades was afraid of, the Persians overwhelming his flanks, was starting to happen in reverse. The Persian line bent back and back until the guys on the flank started to figure out what was going on. When that happened, they would have gotten the fuck out as quick as they could. But they wouldn't have all gotten out. See, what was happening is what's called a double envelopment, and it's pretty rare in military history. You don't often get the right conditions for both flanks of an army to collapse at the same time. And the thing about it happening with an ancient army is that the poor bastards in the center don't know it's happening until it's too late. Because when you're in a rugby scrum with weapons and you're focused on the guy 2 feet in front of you and keeping his spear out of your neck, you're not paying any attention to what's happening more than a few feet away on your left or right. You probably don't even know the flanks are broken until the guy's 10 feet away from you start running, or somebody stabs him in the back because the enemy flanks have closed all the way around you. Congratulations. You just became what we call a poor bastard, and you never even saw it coming. The guys in the Persian center probably thought they were winning, right up until they looked around and found themselves alone. So I can't say for sure if the Greek left and right flanks actually managed to fully encircle what was left of the Persian center. But they got close, and the survivors of the Persian army started hauling ass back toward their ships. The Greeks pursued, but even if they opened up their ranks, they wouldn't have been able to run as fast in their armor as the Persians could with their lighter gear. They ran down the ones they could catch, but the rest got to the ships and pushed off into the surf. Most of the casualty figures I've seen say the Persians lost something like 6,400 guys at Marathon, plus more who ran into the swamps around the battlefield and drowned there. The Athenians lost something like 192, and the Plataeans 11. If you've heard me say how most of the casualties in ancient warfare happened when one side broke and ran, this is what I've been talking about. Of course, the Athenians weren't finished. For all they knew, Artaphernes was taking the fleet to Athens, and they were still outnumbered. So Miltiades sent Phidippides back to Athens. If you're counting, that's something like 350 miles in less than a week. And the army started hauling ass back toward the city. Well, the legend is that Phidippides managed to get back to Athens, found the city council, shouted victory, and died. And that's where we get the race we call the Marathon. But the story comes from a long time after the battle. The contemporary source, a dude named Herodotus, doesn't mention a runner back to Athens. But it's a cool story. And if he did die at the end of that run, well, he damn well had earned it. The Athenian army, though, definitely did march back as fast as they could, although they may not have run. They managed to get back in time to block the Persians from landing, and Artaphernes, realizing he had lost his opportunity, turned his ships around and headed back to the house. The Persians wouldn't try to invade Greece again for another 10 years. Athens came out of the war looking like a badass. When the Spartans finally showed up 2 days after the battle, the Athenians just kind of looked them up and down and said, "Where you been?" The Spartans toured the battlefield, gave an approving nod, and headed home. Darius, as you can imagine, was pissed. He immediately started building up a huge army to avenge his wounded pride. But the bitch of ruling a giant empire is that somebody somewhere is pretty much always pissed at you. And in 486 BCE, he had to go and beat down an Egyptian revolt. He died that same year, and his son Xerxes didn't get around to heading back to Greece until 480. We'll look at that fight in our next critical battle, because it's the other battle everybody knows about between the Greeks and the Persians, the Battle of Thermopylae, or as you may know it, the 300 story. So that's the battle. Let's take a look at the scorecard. So reminder, each principle is graded on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. I'll add a brief explanation for each grade. First one is mass. This is your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefield. Miltiades managed to mass his combat power against the entire Persian line more or less evenly, but with his center weakened and no reserve to exploit enemy weaknesses, it's hard to say he had any critical point in mind. If the Persians had managed to break his center before he could overwhelm them on the flanks, things might have gone very differently. Artaphernes, for his part, doesn't seem to have done any better. He may have expected his archers and his greater numbers to do his work for him. So, they both get a 3 on this one. Offensive. The degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. This one is Miltiades all the way. It's possible Artaphernes goaded the Athenians into fighting, but Miltiades is the one who attacked a numerically superior force at a run. So Miltiades gets a 5 here. And Artaphernes gets a 2. Surprise! Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. An outnumbered force thinning its lines and charging the superior force at a run? I'd say that covers this one. So again, Miltiades gets a 5, Athenians gets a 2. Security. Keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. Neither side really did much of this. Miltiades was clearly watching the Persians closely enough to respond to whatever they did, and he was careful to keep his flanks covered by the terrain and not attack until the Persian cavalry left the field. But if the cavalry had come back at the wrong moment, or Athens had held a force in reserve that the Athenians didn't know about, they would have been pretty well fucked. Athens, for his part, seems to have been overconfident and didn't much bother with security. So Miltiades is going to get a 3 here. And Athens gets a 2. Maneuver. Your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. Miltiades figured out that the Persian infantry wouldn't be able to stand for long toe-to-toe against the hoplites, or the phalanx. So if he could minimize his exposure to the archers and make it a hand-to-hand fight, his Athenians would stand a good chance. Athens may have expected his archers to take care of most of the work, so figured he wouldn't need to maneuver. So Miltiades is going to get a 4 here. Athens gets a 1. Next we have objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. The Athenians were there to kick the Persians' asses back into the water and protect their city. The Persians were there to teach the Athenians a lesson. Doesn't seem to have been a lot of confusion here, although defend my home tends to carry greater moral weight for a soldier than kick these guys' asses. And sometimes that matters. So we're going to give them both a 4 on this one. Unity of command. Every soldier on the battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. Athens probably has the edge on this one, as the designated representative of the world's most powerful king. Miltiades might have been one of 10 rotating Athenian commanders, but even if that's true, nobody seems to have questioned his authority on the day that it really counted. So Miltiades is going to get a 3 here. And Athens gets a 4. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. Both plans were pretty simple. It doesn't get much simpler than attack them from the front, and when they start shooting, start running. So they're both going to get a 4 here. And finally, economy of force. Your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. Neither side did much in the way of force protection. Maybe if the Greeks had fought the way they were supposed to and run away when the arrows started flying, both sides would have higher marks here. As it is, both sides threw everything they had into the fight without much regard for what might happen here. So we're going to give them both a 2 on this one. Although Miltiades does get extra credit for having his guys run when the archers started shooting. So total scores, Miltiades gets a 33. And Athens gets a 24. So Miltiades' plan wasn't brilliant, but his hoplites executed violently. Athens looks like he was just punching the clock. Nothing fancy. We're just going to do the thing that's worked for us every time before. Turns out that didn't cut it that day. So that's it for the Battle of Marathon, 490 BCE. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, I hope you give me a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your nerdy friends about me. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.